The image of German tanks in World War II has long been tied to a myth of invincibility. The Panzer divisions storming across Europe seemed unstoppable. The sight of the Panzer IV, the feared Tiger I, and the mighty Tiger II, or King Tiger, came to symbolize Nazi Germany's military might. To many, these machines appeared to be steel beasts immune to defeat. Yet, history tells us that they were not invincible. In fact, many factors, ranging from Allied tactics and technology to production bottlenecks, and even nature itself, combined to bring down the German tank force. To understand what truly took down German tanks in World War II, we need to look beyond just the weapons that pierced their armor. The story is one of strategy, industry, logistics, and human determination against overwhelming odds. When Germany invaded Poland in 1939, their tanks were not as advanced as the myth suggests. The Panzer I and II were light tanks with thin armor and light armament. They relied heavily on coordination with infantry, artillery, and most importantly, the Luftwaffe. The so-called blitzkrieg was less about the power of the tanks themselves and more about the speed and coordination of the combined arms assault. In Poland and later in France, the German tanks succeeded because they were used smarter, not because they were technologically superior. By 1941, during Operation Barbarossa, Germany unleashed thousands of tanks against the Soviet Union. Here, however, they encountered the legendary T-34, a Soviet tank that shocked German commanders. The T-34 combined sloped armor, good speed, and a powerful 76.2 mm gun. At that time, most German tanks simply couldn't match it. The appearance of the T-34 forced Germany to rapidly develop heavier tanks like the Panther and Tiger. But while these new designs were formidable, they also brought their own weaknesses. The Tiger I, for example, was nearly unstoppable from the front in 1942 and 1943. Its 88 mm gun could destroy almost any Allied tank at long range. Yet the Tiger was expensive, complex, and prone to mechanical breakdowns. Many were lost not in combat, but because they ran out of fuel, got stuck in mud, or broke down and had to be abandoned. One could argue that German engineering brilliance, with its focus on perfection and over-engineering, ironically helped take down German tanks. They built masterpieces that were simply too heavy, too slow to produce, and too fragile in the harsh conditions of war. But what about the weapons that directly destroyed these tanks? The answer is more surprising than many think. It wasn't just other tanks. In fact, more German tanks were destroyed by aircraft, artillery, and handheld weapons than by tank versus tank battles. In the East, the Soviet Union's use of massed artillery and anti-tank guns was devastating. The 76 mm ZIS 3-field gun, used both as artillery and in an anti-tank role, knocked out thousands of German tanks. Later, the Soviets introduced heavier anti-tank guns like the 85 mm and 100 mm, and eventually the monstrous 122 mm gun on the IS-2 heavy tank. But even more critical was sheer quantity. The Soviets could replace their losses faster than the Germans, while the Germans could not. In the West, it was Allied air power that became the nightmare of German tank crews. Fighter bombers like the American P-47 Thunderbolt and the British Typhoon carried rockets and bombs that could devastate armored columns. While rockets were not always as accurate as wartime propaganda claimed, the psychological effect was enormous. German tank crews often abandoned their vehicles at the mere sight of Allied aircraft overhead. By 1944, Allied control of the skies made it nearly impossible for German armor to maneuver in daylight without heavy losses. Then there were the infantry weapons. The American bazooka, the British PIT, and the Soviet PTRD anti-tank rifles had varying levels of success, but by far the most effective was the German Panzerfaust, which ironically turned German designs against themselves. Captured Panzerfausts were used by Soviet soldiers in great numbers, inflicting serious damage on German tanks during the later years of the war. Mines were another underestimated killer. Both the Soviets and the Allies laid millions of anti-tank mines across Europe. Many German tanks were immobilized by mines, then destroyed by artillery or abandoned. A tank that cannot move is as good as destroyed, no matter how thick its armor. Yet perhaps the greatest factor in the downfall of German tanks was not any single weapon, but the crushing weight of Allied industry and logistics. Germany produced roughly 46,000 tanks during the war. The Soviet Union alone produced over 80,000. The United States produced nearly 50,000 Shermans, supported by endless spare parts, fuel, and supply chains that kept them running. German tanks might win one battle, but they could not win the war of attrition. Logistics constantly undermined German armor. Fuel shortages left many tanks stranded. Spare parts were scarce, making field repairs nearly impossible. By 1944, many German tank units went into battle at half strength or less because vehicles had broken down before even reaching the front line. This wasn't just a failure of weapons. It was a failure of strategy, production planning, and resource management. Another often overlooked factor was terrain. The vast Russian steppes, the muddy Rasputitsa, and the frozen winters all took their toll. German tanks were not designed for such conditions. Engines froze, tracks jammed, transmissions failed. In France, the hedgerows of Normandy limited the effectiveness of heavy tanks like the Panther and Tiger. These machines needed open ground to dominate, but the reality of war rarely provided it. By the final year of the war, the image of the invincible German tank had completely collapsed. Panthers and Tigers still terrified Allied infantry, but they could no longer change the outcome. Air power, artillery, mines, infantry weapons, and above all, numbers overwhelmed them. Even the fearsome King Tiger, with its nearly impenetrable armor, could be stopped by coordinated Allied firepower, or simply immobilized and abandoned when fuel ran out. So what really took down German tanks in World War II? It wasn't one single weapon or one decisive battle. It was a combination of relentless Allied production, overwhelming air power, effective anti-tank tactics, crippling logistics, and the harsh realities of nature. German tanks were engineering marvels, but war is not won by marvels. It is won by strategy, supply, and endurance. The myth of the invincible German tank has survived because of their fearsome reputation and striking design. But history shows us that in the end, no matter how advanced, they were just machines. And like all machines, they broke down under the weight of endless Allied attacks and under the sheer impossibility of sustaining a war against nations with far greater industrial power. In the ruins of Berlin in 1945, some of the last defenders were German tanks, fighting street by street. Yet they could not stop the Red Army. Abandoned Tigers littered the roads, silent witnesses to the fact that even the strongest armor can be undone. What really took them down was not just shells and bombs, but the combined willpower of nations that refused to give up until Nazi Germany was crushed. And that is the true story of what took down German tanks in World War II. Not just weapons, but the total weight of global resistance.